I hired a man to fix the yard. He called me. I hear a child crying. Enjoy my new story.
The landscaper I hired to clear my backyard called me 7 times in 40 minutes. When I finally picked up, he asked if anyone else was in my house. I said no. My daughter was at her father's for the weekend. He went quiet for a second too long. Then he said he could hear a child crying from somewhere below my yard, from my basement, and it wasn't a TV. My name is Aria. I'm 31 years old. I work as a billing specialist at Dr. Whitfield's pediatric dental office in Flemington, New Jersey. I file insurance claims, chase down overdue accounts, and spend my lunch breaks eating leftovers I packed at 6 in the morning because buying a sandwich every day is $7 I don't have. I've been divorced for 14 months, and I have a 6-year-old daughter named Phoebe who is my entire universe. My ex-husband, Troy Linden, is the reason I eat those leftovers. When we went through the divorce, Troy showed up to court in wrinkled khakis and a shirt that looked like it had been ironed by someone who'd never seen an iron before. His lawyer told the judge Troy was barely getting by, working part-time at Hartwell Flooring Distributors for $14.50 an hour, maybe 25 hours a week. The judge looked at the numbers and gave me the house, which sounds generous until you realize the house came with a $1,340 monthly mortgage, a furnace that made sounds like a dying animal every November, and a backyard that could have been featured on a nature documentary about what happens when humans give up. I also got $411 a month in child support. Troy kept his freedom and apparently his ability to sleep at night. For 14 months, I've been choosing between fixing things, furnace or brakes or groceries, groceries or Phoebe's field trip. Last month, her school asked for $45 for a trip to the Liberty Science Center. I had $51 in checking. I wrote the check and ate rice for a week. That's not a metaphor, that's a meal plan. But here's the thing that always nagged at me. Every time Troy dropped Phoebe off after his weekends, she'd be wearing new sneakers or a jacket I didn't buy, or she'd mention they went to Friendly's for ice cream. Little things, nothing dramatic. Just enough to make me wonder how a man making $18,000 a year was living better than I was on 38. I told myself I was overthinking it. Told myself maybe he was just better with money, which looking back is like saying maybe the fox is just better at counting chickens. Anyway, the yard. My backyard looked like nature was staging a hostile takeover. The hedges were dead. The fence was leaning like it had given up on life. There was something growing near the shed that I'm fairly certain was developing its own ecosystem. I'd been meaning to deal with it for over a year, and I finally decided that this Saturday, Phoebe was at Troy's for his custody weekend, I was going to hire someone and get it done. My coworker Nina recommended a guy named Garrett Novak. He showed up that morning in a mud-splattered Chevy Colorado with a trailer full of equipment and hands that looked like they'd been shaking hands with dirt for 30 years. Solid guy, no small talk, just pointed at the yard and said he'd have an estimate by the time he finished his coffee. I liked him immediately. I showed Garrett the full disaster, gave him the house key for the bathroom, and headed to the ShopRite on Route 202 for groceries. My phone went into my purse on silent. I don't like shopping with distractions. I need to focus. Grocery shopping on my budget is basically a math competition with emotional consequences. I was loading bags into my trunk when I finally checked my phone. 7 missed calls. Same number, 40 minutes. My stomach dropped before my brain even caught up. I called back. Garrett answered on the first ring, and his voice had that careful tone people use when they're trying not to scare you. He asked if anyone else was supposed to be in my house. I said no. He asked about the basement. I said, what about the basement? And then he told me he'd been working near the bulkhead. That's the exterior entrance on the side of the house that leads down to the back section of the basement. He heard crying, muffled but real. A child. Not a cat, not a TV, not pipes making noise. A child. He called me twice, got no answer, and then called 911. Then he kept calling me. The police were already on their way. I drove home so fast, I'm surprised I still have a license. Now I need to explain something about my basement, because otherwise the next part won't make sense. It's a full unfinished basement. Concrete walls, concrete floor, the works. The interior stairs from my kitchen go down to the front section where my laundry, water heater, and breaker panel are. That's the part I use. 3-4 times a week. Throw in laundry, flip a breaker when the microwave trips it, done. The back section is on the other side of a concrete support wall near the bulkhead entrance. After the divorce, I shoved all of Troy's leftover boxes and my own unpacked stuff back there, stacked them against the walls like a cardboard fortress. I hadn't set foot in that section in 14 months. There was no reason to. It was a dead zone full of things I didn't want to look at from a life I didn't want to remember. When I pulled up to my house, there was already a police cruiser in the driveway. Garrett was standing in the yard, arms crossed, looking relieved to see me. The officers had opened the bulkhead, which I'd assumed was rusted shut. It wasn't. Someone had put a newer padlock on the outside. Not my padlock. We went down the bulkhead stairs, past the stacked boxes, and behind them, in the back corner of my own basement, someone had rearranged everything to create a hidden space, a portable crib, a diaper bag, a playmat with toys, sippy cups on a small folding table, and sitting in that crib, face red and streaked with tears, was a toddler, a little boy, maybe 18 months old. I had never seen this child in my life. My hands were shaking so hard I had to press them against my legs to make them stop. One of the officers asked if I knew whose child this was. I couldn't speak. Then I looked at the diaper bag. There was a monogram tag stitched into the strap, CL, and tucked in the front pocket a business card for a pediatrician, Dr. Roshan Mehta, Raritan Family Care. CL. My ex-husband's last name is Linden. While the officers called it in and paramedics checked the boy, I stood in my own basement trying to process something my brain absolutely refused to accept. Someone had been bringing a child into my house, regularly, secretly, through an entrance I never used, into a section I never visited, while I was at work earning $38,000 a year and counting pennies. And then I heard a car door slam outside. I walked up the bulkhead stairs into the daylight, and there she was, walking across my side yard toward the bulkhead like she'd done it 100 times before. Lenore Linden, Troy's mother, 61 years old, carrying a pharmacy bag and a bottle of Gatorade. She saw the police cruiser and she stopped. She saw me and her face went through about 7 emotions in 2 seconds. Surprise, confusion, fear, and then, this is the part that still makes my blood pressure spike, annoyance, like I was the inconvenience, and I thought, what have you been doing in my house? Before we continue, please hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I read every single one, and your support means the world to me. So, Lenore Linden was standing in my yard, holding a pharmacy bag and a Gatorade, staring at the police car in my driveway like it had personally offended her. The officers brought her to the side and started asking questions. I stood about 10 feet away, close enough to hear everything. Lenore wasn't aggressive. She wasn't hostile. She was flustered, worried, but not about being caught, about the baby. Her first words were about Cody. Is he okay? Where is he? I was only gone for 45 minutes. 45 minutes. She left an 18-month-old alone in a basement for 45 minutes. Here's what came out in the next hour, piece by piece, like pulling threads from a sweater that turned out to be holding the whole thing together. Lenore explained that she'd been watching the boy during weekdays for the past 5 months. She said she started feeling dizzy that morning, lightheaded, maybe a blood pressure spike. She drove herself to the urgent care on Route 12, about 2 miles away. She thought it would be quick. Cody was asleep in the crib. She figured she'd be back in 15-20 minutes. But the urgent care was packed, and the wait stretched to almost an hour. By the time she got out, bought a Gatorade, and drove back, the police were already there. I'll give her this. She wasn't lying about the medical part. The officers confirmed she had a receipt from the urgent care with a timestamp, so she didn't just wander off to get her nails done. She had a real scare, made a bad judgment call, and it blew up. But that context doesn't change the core fact. She'd been entering my home without my knowledge for 5 months. She had a key, Troy's old bulkhead key, the one he was supposed to return after the divorce and never did. It was right there on her keyring between her car key and her ShopRite loyalty card. 5 months of access to my house, 3 to 4 times a week, and I never knew. She came when I was at work. She left before I got home, and she'd been using the back section of my basement, the section I never visited, as a daycare. The officers pressed further. If her usual routine was weekdays only, why was she here on a Saturday? Lenore explained that Sabrina had picked up an extra shift at the car dealership that morning. Troy had Phoebe for the custody weekend and couldn't handle both kids at once, so Lenore came on a Saturday for the first time. She figured I'd be out running errands, which I was. She didn't know I'd hired someone to work in the backyard 10 feet from the bulkhead. When the officers asked why she didn't just watch the baby at her own home, Lenore got quiet for a moment. She lives at Copper Ridge, a 55-plus community off Route 523. Strict lease. No children under 18 allowed as residents or regular guests. She couldn't bring a toddler there multiple days a week without the HOA turning into the FBI, so she used my basement instead. In her mind, the house was empty during the day. She set up a clean little area. She was careful. She didn't go into the rest of the house. She treated it like borrowing a parking spot nobody was using. You know what? I've heard of creative babysitting solutions, but turning your ex-daughter-in-law's basement into an unlicensed daycare has to be a new personal best. The officers identified the child through the pediatrician's card in the diaper bag. Cody Linden, 18 months old, son of Troy Linden and Sabrina Voss. They called Troy. And this is the moment where I had to lean against my own house to keep standing, because my brain was doing math it didn't want to do. Cody was 18 months old. That means he was conceived about 27 months ago. My divorce was finalized 14 months ago. The proceedings started about 6 months before that, 20 months ago, which means Sabrina Voss was pregnant while Troy and I were still technically married, while we were still sitting across from each other at the kitchen table some nights, having those awful quiet dinners where neither person says what they're really thinking, while he was showing up to court in his wrinkled khakis, pretending to be broke. He had an entire second life growing inside another woman, and he sat across from a judge and cried poor. I thought finding a baby in my basement was the worst part of this day. Turns out, it was just the opening act. Troy showed up about an hour later. And here's what scared me more than the basement, more than the baby, more than any of it. He was calm, completely, perfectly calm. No panic, no guilt, no anger. He talked to the officers like he was discussing a delayed package delivery. Friendly, measured, reasonable. He explained that his mother was babysitting his son. She had a medical episode. It was an unfortunate situation, but not a dangerous one. He signed the paperwork. Cody was released to him. He's the biological father, no abuse allegations, so that's how it works in New Jersey. CPS opened an investigation, but the baby went home with Troy that evening. Before he left, Troy looked at me. Just once, a slight nod, like we were two neighbors who'd had a minor disagreement about a fence line. That nod was the most chilling thing I'd ever seen, because it told me everything about how his mind worked. In Troy's world, this was a manageable inconvenience, not a crisis, not a reckoning, just a wrinkle to be smoothed. I've met car salesmen with more visible guilt. CPS didn't close the file, though. A child had been left alone in a space that wasn't a home, wasn't a licensed facility, wasn't anywhere that a toddler should be unsupervised. Lenore would face scrutiny. The investigation would continue. Then Dolores showed up. Dolores Kijek, 74 years old, my next-door neighbor, the woman I should have listened to 5 months ago. She came across her lawn carrying a composition notebook, like she was delivering evidence to a grand jury, which, emotionally speaking, she was. She told me twice. Twice, she mentioned seeing a woman going around the side of my house during weekday afternoons. Twice I waved it off. A meter reader, a delivery person, whatever. Dolores didn't wave things off. Dolores documented them. After I brushed her off the second time, she started keeping a written log. Dates, times, descriptions. Tuesday, 8:17 a.m. Older woman, gray sedan, car seat visible in back, walked to side yard, did not use front door. Entry after entry after entry. She also had Ring doorbell camera footage from her own front door, which had a partial view of my side yard. The footage showed Lenore arriving and leaving like clockwork. Car seat going in, car seat coming out. For months. Dolores stood in my yard and handed me the notebook without a word. Well, almost without a word. She looked at me and said, very gently, "I tried to tell you, sweetheart, twice. Honestly, That hurt almost as much as the rest of it, because she was right. That night, Phoebe was still at Troy's. I was alone in the house. I called my mother, Francine, because when your world falls apart, you call your mom, even when your mom is Francine Berger. My mother has many wonderful qualities. Gentle first reactions are not one of them. Her first words, before "Are you okay?" before "That's terrible," before anything resembling comfort were, "How did you not know, Aria? How did you not check your own basement?" Mothers, they have this incredible ability to find the one thing you're already beating yourself up about and highlight it like it's on a billboard. She wasn't wrong, though, and that was the worst part. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my dryer, the one in the front section of the basement, my section, the normal section, and stared at the concrete wall separating me from the space I didn't know existed in my own home. And I started doing different math, not the painful kind about when Sabrina got pregnant, the financial kind. If Troy was really making $18,800 a year, if he was really that broke, that struggling, then how was he affording diapers, formula, a pediatrician, rent with Sabrina, gas, food for 2 adults and a baby, and $411 a month to me? The numbers didn't add up. They had never added up. I just never had a reason to pull out the calculator until now. Sitting on that dryer at 2 in the morning, I decided I was done being the woman who didn't check. Monday morning, I called in late to work for the first time in 3 years. Nina Sorensen, my coworker, was the first person at the office I told. Nina is the kind of friend who doesn't waste time on sympathy when action is available. She listened to the whole story, then said 4 words. Call my cousin Bridget. Bridget Calloway, family law attorney, Somerville, New Jersey. By 10 o'clock that morning, I was sitting across from her in an office that smelled like coffee and old paper, watching her fill a legal pad with notes while I talked. Bridget wore reading glasses on a chain and had the kind of focus that made you feel like your problems were finally in competent hands. When I finished, the basement, the baby, Troy's calm little nod, Lenore's key, the math that didn't add up, Bridget set down her pen, took off her glasses, and said something that rearranged my entire understanding of the next few months. She said, "This isn't just about your basement. This is about what your ex-husband told a judge under oath." I felt something crack open in my chest when she said that. Not pain, more like a window in a room that had been sealed shut for 14 months, fresh air I didn't even know I needed. Bridget laid out the situation clearly. If Troy had misrepresented his income during the divorce proceedings, the child support order could be reopened. Depending on the scale of the deception, potentially the entire settlement. The basement situation was alarming on its own, but it was also a doorway, because the existence of a secret second child, a girlfriend, and a regular child care arrangement all pointed to a man living well above his declared means. That doesn't prove fraud by itself, but it's a very good reason to start looking. And Bridget knew exactly who to call to start looking. Walt Treadway, forensic accountant, semi-retired, the kind of man who wears suspenders not as a fashion statement, but because he's been wearing them since 1987 and sees no reason to stop. Walt got excited about financial records the way birdwatchers get excited about a rare warbler in the backyard. His eyes lit up, his voice got faster, and he started asking questions I didn't even understand yet. I liked him immediately. Something about a man who finds his joy in other people's hidden money felt cosmically appropriate for my situation. Walt didn't need a spy movie to find Troy's secrets. He started where any good forensic accountant starts, with public records. He went to the New Jersey Division of Revenue's online business registry, typed in Linden, and there it was, Linden Clean LLC, registered in Bound Brook, New Jersey. Owner, Lenore Linden. Registered agent, Troy Linden. Registered agent. That's a person designated to receive legal and official documents on behalf of a business. Troy had listed himself because the form required it, and because he never in a million years expected that anyone involved in a family court case would search state business filings. It's one of those details that lives in the most boring corner of public records, where almost nobody looks. Almost. Walt looked. Linden Clean was a coin-operated laundry business. Troy's late father had started it years ago, and Lenore technically owned it. But the financial trail told a different story. Walt subpoenaed bank records through Bridget. The business revenue had tripled in 2 years. There were now 34 machines across the original Bound Brook location, and the cash flow was significant. Regular deposits from Lyndon Clean's business account into Troy's personal checking, $2,500 here, $3,000 there. Patterns consistent with a cash-heavy laundromat operation, where someone is paying themselves generously. And then there was Troy's real job. His W-2 from Hartwell Flooring Distributors showed a full-time position at $27 an hour. Not part-time, not $14.50, full-time with overtime, pulling in roughly $70,000 a year. The man who showed up to court looking like he couldn't afford a decent shirt was making $70,000 from his day job alone. Add the laundromat cash, another $35,000 to $40,000 a year, and Troy Lyndon's real income was somewhere between $105,000 and $110,000 annually. He told the court he made $18,800. I want you to sit with that number for a second. The difference between $18,000 and $110,000 isn't a rounding error. That's not fudging a few numbers. That's an entire life hidden behind a pair of wrinkled khakis. You know that feeling when you've been swimming against a current for so long that you forgot what still water feels like? And then one day the current just stops, and you realize how exhausted you actually are? That's what sitting in Bridget's office felt like when Walt showed me those numbers. I wasn't happy yet. I wasn't celebrating. I was just still. For the first time in 14 months, the current had stopped pulling. But Walt wasn't done, because Walt is the kind of man who finds one trail and then checks if there are others. He noticed that Lenore was receiving $800 a month from the Lyndon Clean business account. Troy told his mother that was her fair share, that the laundromat barely broke even, and $800 was the best he could do. Lenore never questioned it. She trusted her son. She didn't look at the books because Troy handled everything, and he was her boy. And why would your own child lie to you about something like that? I'll tell you why. Because Troy Lyndon didn't just lie to one person. He lied to all of them. The court, his mother, his girlfriend, me. Each lie was tailored, specific, and designed to keep that person in exactly the right amount of darkness. He gave the court poverty. He gave his mother just enough to feel included. He gave Sabrina a comfortable life without the details. And he gave me $411 and a house with a broken furnace. I went to visit Dolores that week, sat at her kitchen table and asked to see everything. She produced the composition notebook like a librarian producing a first edition. Every entry dated, timed, detailed. Wednesday, 8:22 a.m. Same gray sedan. Woman entered through side yard carrying car seat and canvas bag. Departed 3:47 p.m. She had Ring doorbell footage on her phone organized by date. She had photos taken from her kitchen window of Lenore's car in the driveway, with the car seat visible through the back window. 5 months of documentation that would make most private investigators jealous. When I thanked her, Dolores just straightened her glasses and said she watches a lot of true crime shows. Apparently, it pays off. Bridget reviewed Dolores's file and called it the best unofficial surveillance work she'd seen in 20 years of practice. Between Walt's financials and Dolores's logs, the case was building itself. My mother called that week too. Francine had moved past the initial "how did you not know" phase and entered the guilt about saying that phase, which in Francine language means aggressive helpfulness. She wanted to come over. She wanted to clean the basement. She wanted to change every lock in the house. She wanted to call a lawyer she'd seen on a commercial during the 11 o'clock news. A guy named something like Rick Justice or Brent Power, one of those names that sounds like a character from an action movie. I told her I already had a lawyer, a real one, with a forensic accountant who wears suspenders and gets excited about spreadsheets. Francine wasn't sure about the suspenders part, but she approved of the general direction. Then, on a Wednesday evening, Bridget called me at home. Her voice had that particular energy, controlled but electric, that I was starting to recognize as the sound of Walt finding something. He'd found something. The bank records didn't just show deposits from Lyndon Clean. There was a second source of cash deposits from a different business account, registered under a slightly different name. Lyndon Fresh, LLC. registered in Manville, New Jersey. A second laundromat opened 8 months ago, entirely funded with cash. Lenore's name was nowhere on it. This one was registered to a holding entity that Walt was still tracing, but the deposit patterns into Troy's account were unmistakable. Troy hadn't just been running his father's old laundromat on the side. He'd been expanding, building. A second location, a shadow business, invisible to the court, invisible to his mother, invisible to everyone. The man was constructing an empire out of quarters and deception, and he'd been doing it while I clipped coupons and cried in parking lots. When Bridget told me, I was standing in my kitchen holding a spatula because I'd been making scrambled eggs for dinner. Just eggs, because eggs are cheap, and I was tired. I remember looking at those eggs and thinking, this man has 2 laundromats and I'm eating eggs for dinner. And then I started laughing. Not because it was funny, because the lie was so enormous, so perfectly engineered, that my brain couldn't process it as tragedy anymore. It had crossed into absurdity. He was making over $100,000 a year and had convinced a judge he couldn't afford to pay me more than $411 a month. Bridget let me laugh. Then she said, "We have everything we need. It's time to file." By the 3rd week after that Saturday, I had a forensic accountant who wore suspenders and a lawyer who smelled blood in the water. What I didn't have yet was the full picture. Turns out Troy's lies had layers like a bad lasagna. Every time you peeled one back, there was another one underneath, somehow worse than the last. Walt Treadway's discovery of Linden Fresh, the second laundromat in Manville, changed the scope of everything. Linden Clean in Bound Brook was the family business, started by Troy's late father, technically owned by Lenore. That one at least had a history. Linden Fresh was different. It was opened 8 months ago, funded with cash, and Lenore's name wasn't on it at all. Troy had set it up through a separate LLC, registered to a holding entity that Walt eventually traced back to, surprise, Troy himself, using a slightly different version of his legal name and a P.O. box for the business address instead of a home address. He'd been careful. I'll give him that. Troy wasn't some sloppy guy leaving receipts in his jacket pocket. He paid cash wherever he could, kept separate accounts, and used his mother's name as a shield for the original business while building the second one entirely in the shadows. If it weren't for the fact that his mother got dizzy in my basement on a Saturday morning, nobody would have looked at any of this. His whole system was designed to be invisible, and it almost was. Almost is a beautiful word when it's working in your favor. Bridget built the case file like a woman constructing a brick wall. Methodical, precise, every piece placed exactly where it needed to be. Troy's real W-2 from Hartwell Flooring showing full-time employment at $27 an hour versus the part-time at $14.50 story he'd given the court. Walt's forensic analysis of both laundromat operations, revenue streams, cash deposits, the pattern of transfers into Troy's personal account. The New Jersey Division of Revenue filings showing Troy as registered agent for Linden Clean and the sole organizer of Linden Fresh, LLC. Dolores Kijek's surveillance notebook and Ring doorbell footage documenting 5 months of Lenore's visits. The CPS investigation report. Every piece connected to the next like a chain that was slowly wrapping around Troy's carefully constructed story and squeezing. You know, there's something almost poetic about a man who built his deception on cash from laundromats being taken down by paperwork. All those quarters, and he couldn't buy his way out of a spreadsheet. Around week 4, something happened that I did not expect. And honestly, it was the twist that changed my understanding of Troy more than anything else. CPS was still investigating the basement situation. That process was separate from my civil case, running on its own track. As part of their standard procedure, investigators interviewed Sabrina Voss. She was cooperative, calm, answered their questions about Cody's care routine, the arrangement with Lenore, household details, standard stuff. But during one of these interviews, the investigator mentioned Troy's income as declared in our divorce, $18,800 a year. Sabrina went quiet because Sabrina didn't know that number. She knew Troy made decent money. She lived with him. They had a nice enough apartment in Raritan. They went out to eat. Troy's truck was a 2021 Ram with leather seats. Their life wasn't lavish, but it wasn't $18,000 a year either. Sabrina had never seen the divorce filings. She wasn't part of those proceedings. When she asked Troy about it back when they first got together, he told her the divorce was handled. He paid support. Arya got the house. End of story. She had no reason to dig deeper until a CPS investigator casually mentioned a number that didn't match the life she was living. I want to be honest here. Part of me expected Sabrina to be a villain in this story. The other woman, the one who helped Troy hide everything. But that's not what happened, and I think the truth is more interesting than the version I had in my head. Sabrina didn't know about the financial fraud. She wasn't in on it. She was just another person Troy had given exactly the amount of information he wanted her to have, and nothing more. When Sabrina realized what Troy had told the court, two things clicked in her head almost simultaneously. First, the man she was raising a child with was a much more skilled liar than she'd understood. Second, if this whole thing unraveled, and it was unraveling, she could be perceived as a knowing participant. She'd been living with Troy, sharing expenses, benefiting from money that should have been going to his first child's support. She could look complicit even though she wasn't. Self-preservation is a powerful motivator. Sabrina started cooperating with the CPS investigators, not to help me, not out of guilt, not because she suddenly felt sisterly solidarity. She did it to establish a clear record that she didn't know. She provided bank statements showing their shared household expenses. She confirmed that Troy ran both laundromat locations, that he left early, came home smelling like detergent and dryer sheets, handled maintenance calls on weekends. She confirmed his full-time schedule at Hartwell. She gave investigators details that supported what Walt was already finding in the financial records. Troy had built his deception on the assumption that the people around him would stay in their assigned roles, his mother as the grateful caretaker, Sabrina as the trusting girlfriend, me as the struggling ex-wife who'd never fight back. He never planned for what would happen if all three of us saw the full picture at the same time. That was his one miscalculation. Bridget told me something around this time that stuck with me. She said most financial fraud in divorce cases doesn't get caught through dramatic revelations or smoking guns. It gets caught because liars have to keep too many stories straight for too many people, and eventually, someone compares notes. Troy's whole system depended on isolation, keeping each person in their own little bubble of half-truths. The basement broke those bubbles open, and now everything was leaking into everything else. In the meantime, I had the hardest job of all, acting normal. Bridget was clear about this. Do not confront Troy. Do not mention lawyers, evidence, investigations, or forensic accountants. Do not change your behavior during custody exchanges. Let him think the basement situation is being handled as a minor CPS matter and nothing more. Let him believe his system is still intact. So every other Friday, Troy pulled up in his Ram truck, and Phoebe ran out to him with her overnight bag, and I stood on the porch and waved and said, "Have a good weekend," like my entire legal strategy wasn't built on destroying the life he thought he was protecting. I smiled at a man I knew was lying to a degree that made my stomach turn, and I let him drive away with my daughter, thinking he'd gotten away with it. Those Friday evenings were the loneliest moments of this whole ordeal. Worse than the basement, worse than the math. Just me and the performance of normalcy, standing on a porch in Flemington, waving. Around week 5, Sabrina's early attempt to reach out resurfaced in a different light. Before she'd learned the truth about the court filings, back during the first week of the CPS investigation, she had sent me a Facebook message. It was carefully worded, almost certainly coached by Troy. "I know this situation was handled badly, and I'm sorry your home was involved. Troy says everything is being worked out. I hope we can keep things from getting more complicated than they need to be." Friendly on the surface, but I could hear Troy's fingerprints all over those words. I'd screenshotted it and sent it to Bridget the day I received it. Bridget filed it. Everything was getting filed. I started putting $25 a week into a savings account during this period, not because it made any real financial difference, because I needed to feel like I was building something instead of just enduring something. $25 a week is nothing and everything. It was the first money I'd saved in over a year, my own private act of faith that things were about to change. At week 8, Bridget filed the motion, a petition to modify child support based on newly discovered evidence of concealed income. The discovery package, Walt's forensic analysis, the business registrations, the W-2 comparisons, Sabrina's statements, Dolores's documentation, the CPS reports, was sent to Troy's attorney, a man named Howard Pruitt, who I'd later learn had a reputation for being competent but unenthusiastic, the kind of lawyer who does his job the way some people do yard work, more adequately, without passion. Bridget told me what would happen next. She said his lawyer is going to read this file, and the first thing he's going to do is call me. And his first words will be about settling this before a hearing. That's how you know the file did its job. 3 days later, Howard Pruitt called Bridget's office. His first words, "Can we discuss resolving this before we get to a hearing?" I was at my desk at Dr. Whitfield's office when Bridget texted me the update. I stared at my screen for a full minute. Then I went back to filing an insurance claim for a kid who needed a crown on a baby tooth, because that's the thing about fighting for your life. You still have to do your actual job while it's happening. Howard Pruitt's first offer came through exactly 1 week after he received the evidence package. Troy was willing to increase child support to $900 a month and pay $5,000 in retroactive adjustment. That was it, $900 and $5,000. As if the difference between $18,000 and $110,000 could be smoothed over with a handshake and some rounding. Bridget called me from her office. I could hear something in her voice. Not frustration, more like professional amusement, the quiet kind that comes from having seen this play out before. She said the offer wasn't serious. It was a temperature check. Troy and Howard wanted to see how much we actually knew and how hard we'd push. Bridget rejected it and didn't counter. She said sometimes the most powerful move is to say no and say nothing else. Let them sit in the silence and wonder what's coming. I spent that week trying to focus on work, on Phoebe's school routine, on normal life. But my brain kept circling back to that number, $900. Troy's first instinct, even when caught, was to lowball. Even facing evidence of $110,000 in real income, his opening move was to offer me less than 1% of what he'd hidden. Some habits run deep, I guess. I started thinking about the fact that I have a jar in my kitchen where I keep loose change, quarters, dimes, whatever falls out of pockets. In 14 months, that jar had collected about $47. Troy was making $40,000 a year in quarters from laundromats. We were both collecting coins. The difference was that his coins paid for a boat, and mine paid for a jar of pennies on the counter that Phoebe likes to shake like a maraca. Round 2 came the following week. Howard proposed $1,200 a month with $10,000 retroactive. Better, but still not close. Bridget responded this time, not with a counteroffer, but with a detailed summary of Walt's full forensic analysis, both laundromat locations, the exact cash flow figures, the gap between declared and actual income laid out in clean columns with dates and amounts. She also included a single sentence at the bottom of her letter that Bridget later told me she'd been waiting to write for 3 weeks. My client is prepared to present this evidence in a hearing. We are also prepared to discuss the perjury implications with the court at that time. Perjury. That word carries weight. Lying under oath about your income in a divorce proceeding isn't just a civil matter, it's a criminal one. If this went to a hearing and the judge saw the full picture, a referral to the county prosecutor was almost guaranteed. Howard Pruitt knew that, and now Troy knew it too. Bridget told me that after she sent the forensic summary, there was a full week of silence from Howard's office. No calls, no emails, no counter. Just quiet. She said that was a good sign. It meant Howard was having a very serious conversation with his client about exactly how bad this could get. Troy was used to controlling information, controlling people, but you can't control a forensic accountant's spreadsheet. Numbers don't negotiate. Numbers just sit there and tell the truth, which is something Troy hadn't done in years. During that quiet week, Lenore's criminal case resolved separately. She was charged with criminal trespass and child endangerment for the basement arrangement. Her attorney negotiated the endangerment charge down. The medical circumstances helped. She'd had a documented dizzy spell, went to urgent care, had a receipt with a timestamp. She didn't abandon Cody maliciously. She made a terrible judgment call during a medical scare. The court took that into account. Lenore pleaded to criminal trespass, 18 months probation, a restraining order keeping her away from my property, and a criminal record at 61 years old for the first time in her life because her son put her in a position where helping her grandchild meant breaking the law. I didn't feel good about Lenore's situation, and I want to be honest about that. I didn't feel sorry for her either. She entered my home without permission for 5 months, but I understood in a way I wished I didn't, that Lenore was another person Troy had used. He gave her the key, the access, the arrangement. He let her believe she was helping the family. He just didn't mention that the help involved trespassing or that the money he could have spent on real daycare was sitting in his personal account, growing like a weed. Lenore's probation meant she couldn't come within 500 feet of my house. For context, that's longer than the distance she drove to the urgent care that started all of this. I'm not sure she appreciated the irony, but I did. Week 13. Howard Pruitt called Bridget again. His tone had shifted entirely. Bridget could hear it immediately. No more testing, no more lowballs. Troy was ready to discuss real numbers. They went back and forth over several days. Bridget pushed for 3 things: modified child support that reflected Troy's actual income, full retroactive adjustment for 14 months of underpayment, and an equitable redistribution from the hidden business income that should have been part of the original divorce settlement. Troy pushed back through Howard on every point, but each pushback got weaker, because the alternative, a full hearing where everything went on the public record, followed almost certainly by a perjury referral, was worse than any number Bridget was asking for. Troy was negotiating against a clock, and he knew it. The final consent order was signed in week 14. Both lawyers agreed to terms. The judge reviewed and approved it, and it was done. Modified child support, $1,740 a month going forward, calculated from Troy's actual income, the way it should have been from the beginning. Retroactive adjustment, $18,606. That's the difference between the $411 he'd been paying and what he should have been paying, multiplied by 14 months. He owed that immediately. Equitable redistribution, $37,500. My share of the Linden Clean and Linden Fresh business income that had been hidden during the original divorce proceedings, payable in installments from business revenue over 18 months. Total financial shift, approximately $56,000 in my direction, plus the ongoing increased support. I got the news from Bridget on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at my desk at Dr. Whitfield's office, between a rejected insurance claim and a phone call I needed to return about a billing discrepancy. Bridget called and told me the judge had signed the order. She read me the numbers. She asked if I had questions. I said I'd call her back. Then I hung up, walked to the bathroom, closed the door, and cried for about 10 minutes. Not from sadness, not even from joy, exactly. From release. 14 months of pressure. The counting, the choosing, the pretending, the rice dinners, the crying in parking lots, all of it had been pressing down on me so steadily and for so long that I'd stopped noticing the weight, and then it lifted, and my body didn't know what to do except let go of everything it had been holding. I washed my face, went back to my desk, and finished the billing discrepancy call. Because life doesn't pause for catharsis. You just carry it with you into the next task and try not to let your voice shake. The county prosecutor received the perjury referral that same week. Troy now faced potential criminal charges for lying under oath about his income. Even if he eventually negotiated a plea to avoid jail time, the referral alone was a permanent mark. A public record that Troy Linden had been caught lying to a court about money while his 6-year-old daughter's mother skipped lunches to afford field trips. That evening, I picked Phoebe up from after-school care. She climbed into the back seat, buckled herself in, she's very proud of doing that on her own, and asked me why I was smiling. I told her I just had a good day at work. She said that was nice and asked if we could have pasta for dinner instead of eggs. I said yes. We could have pasta. The first retroactive check cleared on a Friday, $18,606, deposited into the same checking account that had $51 in it the month Phoebe needed field trip money. I looked at the number on my banking app and couldn't even process it as real for about 3 hours. I kept refreshing the page like it might disappear. It didn't disappear. I paid off my credit card first. $4,200 at 22.9% APR, a balance I'd been carrying for 11 months, making minimum payments that barely covered the interest. Watching the number refuse to shrink like it was mocking me. Gone. One payment, done. You know that feeling when you take off shoes that have been too tight all day? It was like that, but for my entire financial existence. Then the furnace. I'd been nursing that furnace through 2 winters with duct tape, prayers, and a space heater in Phoebe's room as backup. The repair guy, a man named Stu from a company in Reddington, looked at it and said the nicest thing anyone had said to me in months. "Ma'am, we can fix this properly. Not a patch, not a workaround, a real fix." I almost hugged Stu. I did not hug Stu, because Stu was holding a wrench. But the impulse was there. The car was next. My transmission had been making a sound that I can only describe as mechanical suffering, a grinding whine that got worse on hills and completely disappeared when I turned the radio up, which was my primary repair strategy for 8 months. The real fix cost $1,400. I paid it without calculating how many lunches I'd need to skip to cover it. That calculation, the one that used to run automatically in my head every time I spent money, just stopped. Not because I was rich, because I was no longer doing math to survive. I started Phoebe's college fund, $150 a month into a 529 plan. It's not going to pay for Harvard, but it exists. It's real. It has her name on it. And every month it grows a little, which is more than I could say about anything in our lives for the past 14 months. I want to be clear about something. I didn't become wealthy. I didn't buy a new car or take a vacation or redecorate the house from top to bottom. What I became was stable. I became a woman who could buy brand name cereal instead of the store brand bag that tastes like cardboard with ambition. I became a woman who could say yes to the field trip, yes to the pasta, yes to the repair, without that cold knot forming in my stomach. Stability isn't glamorous, but when you've lived without it, it feels like the biggest luxury in the world. The redistribution payments from the laundromat revenue started coming in monthly installments after that. $37,500 spread over 18 months. Each deposit was another small confirmation that the system had finally done what it was supposed to do. Troy's world contracted quietly, and I'll keep this brief because his story isn't the point. Mine is. The perjury referral hung over him like weather he couldn't outrun. Sabrina left within 2 months of the consent order being signed. Not in a blowout, not with screaming. She packed methodically over a weekend while Troy was at work, took Cody, and moved to a 1-bedroom in Edison. She told the CPS investigator in her final interview that she couldn't build a life with someone whose first instinct in every situation was to lie. I heard that secondhand through Bridget. I never spoke to Sabrina directly. We weren't friends. We weren't enemies. We were just 2 women who'd made the mistake of trusting the same man. Lenore stopped speaking to Troy after she found out, through the legal proceedings, just how much money Linden Clean was actually generating. $800 a month. He'd been paying his own mother $800 a month from a business her husband built, while pocketing tens of thousands. The laundromat still operated, but the family trust that held them together was gone. Some machines run fine without maintenance for a while, but eventually everything that's neglected breaks down. I imagine Troy understood that better than most, given that neglect was kind of his specialty. I had the bulkhead entrance properly sealed. New steel door, new deadbolt, my key only. A locksmith from Clinton did the work and didn't ask questions, which I appreciated because my ex-mother-in-law was running an underground daycare in my basement isn't a story you want to tell twice. Then I cleaned out the back section, took out the crib, the toys, the diaper bag, all of it. Scrubbed the floor, hauled away the boxes I'd been avoiding for 14 months. Troy's old stuff. My unpacked baggage from the divorce, all the things I'd shoved into the dark because I didn't have the energy to deal with them. I put down a rug I found at a consignment shop in Lambertville, dark blue, slightly worn, perfectly fine, set up a secondhand armchair and a floor lamp, added a small bookshelf. Phoebe found it before I even told her about it. She went downstairs to explore, her word, and came back up with her eyes wide and declared it the cozy room. She started doing her homework down there, reading her library books. She'd bring a blanket, curl up in the armchair, and disappear for an hour. The space that had been used without my knowledge, without my permission to hide someone else's secret, my daughter turned it into her favorite place in the house. A basement that held someone else's lies now holds my kids' bookshelf. I think that's the best renovation I've ever done. 0 permits required. I brought Dolores flowers the week everything was finalized, stood on her porch with a bouquet of grocery store daisies and a card that said, "Thank you for watching out for me, even when I didn't want you to." Dolores took the flowers, looked at them, looked at me, and said, "Sweetheart, I've been watching this street since before you were born. You're the first person who ever came back and said thank you." Then she invited me in for coffee and showed me 3 new entries in her notebook. Apparently, the family 2 doors down is getting a suspicious number of late-night deliveries. Dolores never stops. God bless that woman. My mother, Francine, never did formally apologize for the "how did you not know" comment. That's not how Francine works. But she started picking Phoebe up from school every Wednesday so I could leave work on time instead of rushing. She started bringing over meals on Sundays, casseroles, soups, her brisket that takes 4 hours and is worth every minute. She shows love through action, not words, and once I stopped waiting for the words, I could see the love just fine. Last week, Phoebe asked me what used to be in the cozy room before it was the cozy room. I told her it used to be storage, just boxes and old stuff. She thought about it for a second and said, "That's boring. It's way better now." Yeah, baby, it really is. Some people build their whole lives on keeping others in the dark. They count on your exhaustion. They count on your trust. And most of the time, it works because life is busy and people are tired, and who has the energy to go looking for lies they don't even know exist? But every now and then, you hire a guy to fix the yard, and he hears something he wasn't supposed to hear. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of this one. If this story meant something to you, more of my stories are already right there on your screen. Tap 1 and I'll see you in just a moment. Take care of yourselves.